I've taught here at Washtenaw for many years, and now as an adjunct, and now I'm teaching at U of M in the medical school. I'm teaching anatomy there. So my career started out in anatomy physiology way back when I was a doctoral student at Maryland. I made the mistake of being fascinated with biology and comparative anatomy and physiology, so I took all these comparative anatomy courses even though I wanted to be a conservation biologist so badly. And I got out there to Maryland to do some research, which I'll show you in a minute, some of the things they did, but they kept saying, hey, we need you to teach this human anatomy and physiology class. You have all this comparative anatomy, you need to teach it because we don't have anybody. And I'm like, do I have to? He said, yes, you have to, we won't pay you. So that's basically the beginning of all this, and it's paid the bills. You know, I can't complain about it. But it has taken me a little bit away from my love and interest in conservation biology, and I've never really lost that. I still have that in me, and I've been ruminating about some ideas for the last 20 years now, I think, going along here. This is a slide I made years ago, and I would show students, just letting them know the state of affairs in the world and how human beings are basically just decimating the planet. And you can talk about how much topsoil is lost, how much arable land is lost, how much rainforest is lost. We know these statistics. 40 million people die of starvation. This is probably more now. It's about 300 jumbo jets crashing a day. It's a really significant loss of life and biodiversity, as well as just resources in general. And lately I've gotten kind of sucked into this show, Gold Rush, on Discovery Channel. I don't know if you watched this. You should watch at least once to see these crazy guys out there just digging up every last flake of gold they can find up there in the Yukon, Alaska. And they're just absolutely plowing away all the wilderness, all the trees, just to get to that gold. Now there's a new show. It just came on last night. Right after that, there's these two guys over in Uganda just decimating their little plot of land. But apparently the Chinese have been over there just wiping out rainforests left and right to get to the gold. It's really, really sad and depressing you think about it. And no one really stops to think about what that means. I don't think the general public even worries about biodiversity at all. They hear global warming, but they don't really make biodiversity, the protection of biodiversity, a national mandate or a global incentive, a charge to go after and protect it. You look at the world and how it's changed in the last 300, 400 million years. This Pangea breaking up here. You got today's world. And of course, there's a lot of species that have come along in that time. And certainly these species are important today to us economically, right? But I think as scientists right now, we focus on biodiversity almost as if it's an insurance policy. We need to save biodiversity because, well, in this case, there was a blight that nearly wiped out all of the world's rice crops back in the late 1980s. 2/3 of the world's population depends on rice. So fortuitously, somebody had some wild rice grains from an extinct species in a seed bank, found they had a resistant gene to the blight, hybridized that with the world's rice crops, and today we're going along just fine, feeding the world with the rice. Okay? So they said, well, we need to save biodiversity because there's genetics, there's genes out there important to save. Or maybe there's some medicines in the tropics. And they made a movie, Medicine Man, with Sean Connery. Remember that? So it's almost as if it's an insurance policy. And I've always been kind of, I don't know, I think there's something more there. I was always thinking there's something more intrinsic to wanting to save biodiversity that we're really just not hitting it. And I wasn't quite sure what that was at the time, back when I was starting as an undergraduate at Eastern and then as a graduate student at Michigan State. I still wasn't quite sure what that was. But certainly we can see through time how as the planet has evolved and continents have drifted apart and come together and life has evolved and progressed through time. We start out with very simple organisms that tend towards complexity over time. We can talk about the many types of complex life forms we have today versus how scant we have evidence of them back in the past. So, it seems that in terms of biological systems, we have simplicity tending towards complexity. Certainly over geologic time, very few individuals given a chance to replicate and produce as many as they possibly can over time. Put it together, you got a few simple life forms becoming more complex life forms. That's biodiversity. So we have what? How many species today? What do you quote your students on the planet?
1.8.
How many different species of organisms on the planet right now, or we estimate? It's a variable. They say about 20 million. I think it's less than that now because we've been doing a good job of getting rid of a lot of them, okay? 8,000 species of birds, 4,000 species of mammals, roughly. Perhaps 1 million species of insects, 900,000 of those are beetles, different beetle species. So certainly there's a tremendous amount of diversity out there, and there's estimates that number will drop perhaps by half as we close in the next 2 or 3 decades here. We are just completely destroying so much of the habitat out there on the planet. So from a historical perspective, especially even from my historical perspective, I thought I would kind of march through some of the things that I learned and experienced going through school, through graduate school, and kind of where I've come from, so you can see kind of where I'm going and where I think we should focus our attentions as biologists, as scientists, and also as educators too. This is Michigan, back in the lumber days of Michigan, northern Michigan. These are a bunch of white pines. The loggers from Sweden and Finland, yeah, you know, they came over to cut down the trees here in Michigan, especially in the UP, so you have that nice UP accent, right? They brought their pasties, all that good stuff. They say that when the first Europeans got here to Michigan, a squirrel never had to touch the ground. A squirrel can go anywhere in the upper canopy from one end of the state to the other, till it got the Straits of Mackinac, of course, all right? Then it could swim, right? So what happened? So starting about, certainly around 1870, the loggers just went full tilt and just completely wiped out almost all the timber in the state, okay? They cut with axes and saws. They corded it up. Imagine these poor horses having to haul that on these skids, right? At least there's snow, yeah, you know. And then they get them, to Grand Rapids, right? Drop them in the river, and you can see how quickly they decimate it. They kind of look like a nuclear holocaust in this state by the time the 1930s rolled around. There really wasn't hardly any forest land left. So you imagine many different species of animals went almost extinct, like deer. You could hardly find a deer back then. There wasn't really any good habitat for it. So certainly what you see when you go out in the forest today are predominantly secondary growth forests, except for a few areas. Like this one up in northern Marquette, northern Michigan by Marquette. That's my wife. Back then she was my fiance, and that's me. And she's in front of a sugar maple, the state's largest sugar maple. And I'm in front of the state's largest basswood tree. And you can see the diameter. So imagine wherever your local campuses are in the state, imagine trees this size, right? Everywhere. And just a beautiful canopy. You know, you can just blot out the sun. Just an amazing kind of forest and ecosystem that used to be here. Yeah?
Is that the Huron Mountains?
Yes, this is exactly it. This is the Huron River Mountain Club up on Marquette. Very private mountain hunting club. Old money goes there from Chicago mostly. I think back then in the 1990s you had to have $60,000 a year membership fee. 60 grand a year just to maintain your membership there. So old world money, or old money, new world, I should say, right? To belong. And in order to get a membership, you have to either marry into it or inherit one. Okay, so very exclusive place. And I had the opportunity to do research up there looking at cowbirds for my master's at Michigan State. You can see the nice little brown-headed male cowbird here. Maybe you've heard of these, you know, as biologists, I'm sure. Wonderful animals. They run around laying their eggs in the nest of other species very quickly, very efficiently. Breeding female will live 2 years, kind of like the Bic lighter of animals. They live fast, die young. They lay about 80 eggs in those 2 breeding seasons. And they'll just basically lay their eggs anywhere they can find an open nest. And the nice thing about in this new ecosystem that they've invaded in, say, the last 100 years, which is everything pretty much east of the Mississippi, as we deforested that area, we opened up all these fragmented forests and agricultural lands were introduced, so the animal came in from the plains, which is where its natural history starts. They used to follow the bison around, right? And had a good opportunity to come in and do its job, basically parasitizing other species. Why does it parasitize? Because it can, right? It almost has to, because if the bison are moving along, they have to follow it. They really don't have an opportunity to nest anywhere because the bison are always moving. Well, why do they care about the bison? Well, because they chop up the ground and expose seeds and lay them bare so they can come along and walk after the bison and eat all these grains that are left bare by the bison hoofs. So they kind of evolved in that sort of natural habitat. So it makes sense as we, in our New World Order, created this particular type of environment out here now. We've got rid of the forest, we've got our ag lands, we've got our cities, we've got our bird feeders. They've moved in, they're doing very nicely. Problem is this poor animal right here, the Kirtland warbler, is barely hanging on up there in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula. So they have to develop these cowbird traps to catch them, and then they'll put a tarp over them, hook it up to a car, and gas them with exhaust, carbon monoxide poisoning. They'll let go of any of the other species that are native and not a pest, but then they'll just try to go after the cowbirds in these traps. Very clever traps. They kind of walk in through little mesh wire openings around the top and the sides. They'll find the grain in here, but they forget how to get back out. Okay, so it's pretty clever. Here's the bison, of course, and you can imagine once upon a time there were millions of bison, right? Millions of bison. And then within about a 30-year period, they were decimated down to maybe 500 bison left. So who did the shooting? Well, of course, our European ancestors, the cowboys, right? It was an interesting policy to starve out the Native Americans by taking away their food source. So they completely reshifted and directed the entire ecosystem out there. We introduced their cattle, and things aren't quite the same. So here's a cowbird egg. Here's perhaps an egg of a robin. And fortunately for the robin, they can actually recognize the egg. They'll puncture eject and get rid of it. Catbirds will do that too. They can recognize the cowbird egg. But the other 200 migratory bird species out here, they can't recognize the egg. So they accept it. And these cowbird eggs are usually bigger than the surrounding chicks after they've hatched. They'll grow up and fledge very quickly. They usually fledge a day or two before anybody else. In fact, I think from start to finish, from hatching to fledging, it's about 14 to 15 days, which, I don't know if you know anything about birds, that's an amazing rate of development. They grow faster, they push the other young out, kind of like cuckoos do, right? And they're a generalist. They're a generalist parasite because they can be. They can have all these opportunities to find nest and lay their eggs. So there's the cowbird again. Here's sort of the state of Michigan in many areas. We have lots of ag lands interspersed with forests where these different neotropical migratory birds live. And the cowbirds like to hang out on the edges because they're lazy, right? They just look in there, find a nest, lay an egg, then run out, find some seed. Then they'll breed, find a roost site. Next morning, go out, find another nest, lay another egg. And they just go that way all the way through spring. So one of the things I had to do was locate suitable hardwood forest lands of varying different sizes, different fragment sizes in different areas. There's a Huron National Forest, Pigeon River County State Forest, Hiawatha National Forest, and the Huron Mountain Club. So it's pretty much a gradient. You have a lot of ag lands here, lesser ag lands and disturbances, but you have clear cuts in these areas, and then you have a pristine virgin hardwood forest right up there, never been touched, right? So that private hunt club basically saved all the indigenous species that were there. They did very little lumbering up there. So you imagine here on Mountain Club, nice pristine sort of looking canopy of forest. Looks nice, doesn't it? Okay, then you come down to the other national forest, and they're out busily cutting down these gigantic trees, right? Well, there really aren't any gigantic trees. They think that's a saw timber size. That's not a saw timber size, but the whole world is desperate for lumber, and we're just doing this everywhere. So we don't even allow the trees to get to a decent size anymore. We'll chip it up, we'll make boards. It's not a coincidence you got particle board and chip boards to build your houses out of, because that's all they can make now, right? It's pretty sad. Or they'll actually dredge up trees that drowned out there in Lake Michigan back in the lumbering days. There's still some those original trees that actually drowned, and they can pull them up and they can actually lumber and sell them off. Here's Hiawatha National Forest up there along Lake Michigan. You can see there's some fragmentation from clear cutting there. Not a lot of agriculture though. And of course, if you come down into the lower peninsula, you can see we have national forests interspersed with ag lands, depending where you are going up north. And if you're going north, of course, towards Saginaw or further, you're going to see, these ag lands, and you get far enough north, as a break, and you got back into the forest lands again. So you expect that these cowbirds would favor any area they have seed resources, parasitizing ability or nests that they can parasitize. All these things sort of juxtaposed together. So you have a high cowbird abundance in, say, the Huron National Forest. But where you have just a little bit of clear cutting, less ag, less urban areas, less bird feeders, right? All these things, then you have fewer cowbirds. And if you have a pristine, large enough area, you don't have any cowbirds, right? So what I did is I would take a census site and I'd find a forest fragment, and I would look to see the occurrence of cowbirds in these different areas. And basically found that if a cowbird is out here from 3 kilometers out, if that's the closest it'll get, then these birds in here are safe, okay? And another way of looking at this is if there are ag lands, urban settings out beyond 3 kilometers, then you tend not to have cowbirds get to the center of that forest area. So in Michigan, at least, you need a 3-kilometer buffer from your nesting birds to your nearest ag land or livestock lot or seed lot, okay? So, and you can see sort of this cowbird probability depending on if you have the presence or absence of agricultural lands in each of those different belt zones. You can see a higher probability if you have a food source, basically, for them to find their brood parasites opportunity. So I developed a cowbird model. I'm not going to go through it. I'm not even sure I can remember it anymore. It was so long ago. But basically, you could predict based on certain variables like the vertical cover, amount of agriculture, height of the trees. There's a logistic regression equation I came up with that you could predict cowbird occurrence from Michigan. But this doesn't apply other places. Different states have different land use patterns. Well, long and short of it is, when I was done with that study, I had a new appreciation for landscape level ecology and how that influences distribution of different species of plants and animals. And I was fortunate enough to go to the University of Maryland and study Brazil, the Gold Lion tamarins in Brazil. So I have the opportunity to go to Brazil after I started my doctoral degree at Maryland and take what I learned and apply it for this highly endangered species of monkey, the Gold Lion tamarin. Okay, so off I went. Here they are. Cute little guys, right? One of the rare, true monogamous mammalian species out there. After the mom gives birth to twins, usually in the spring, Dad picks them up, puts them on his back, and he spends the energy to carry them around and take care of them. And then every time they nurse, they crawl off him, get on her, nurse, and then get back on him. Okay? So it's kind of like, all right, so you carried around the baby for 9 months, now I'll carry it around for the next 9 months. Kind of like Dad's helping out, right? And they're very protective of their mates and of their young. The males are allowed, so let's say the sons are allowed to stay in the group, but the daughters are kicked out. You have to get out. So the mom's going to chase them away. Problem is, where are they going to go? Start a new family when you got no forest left, right? So where they're isolated is one of the last remaining tracts of the Atlantic coast rainforest. Never mind the Amazon, which is going away very quickly. The Atlantic coast rainforest is nearly gone. Okay, so these monkeys are isolated to just a few little reserves around Rio de Janeiro, right? They like to say Rio down there. And a few more monkey species of different varieties are up along the northern coast. They're also suffering tremendous habitat loss as well. But Poça das Antas was the main reserve for the Gold Lion tamarins. Another reserve north is Ribeirão de Una. This is a reserve for the golden-headed lion tamarins. So there's golden lion tamarins and there's golden-headed lion tamarins. So different species of primates that are undergoing the same problems, right? Their habitat loss is significant. They have no place to go to breed or to survive. This is the reserve in Poça das Antas, that's my shack. It's where I got to hang out. Got to watch bats flying in. I got to watch mice running around. I saw spiders playing tug of war with wasps and wasps playing tug of war with spiders. It was a lot of fun. It was great. Just having my morning coffee, I can just watch all these projects in front of me take life of their own. So then we'd go out and chase down the monkeys. They were habituated. They had radio collars. We could track them, find them, and we'd chase them around all day. They'd let us. They might throw stuff at us once in a while, but they were pretty cool. And we'd go along. In some areas, you had openings like this starting to form. We had squatter farmers going in and denuding the forest to grow manioc or grow banana. Or in some areas, they grow cocoa. So they had lots of different types of agriculture they're trying to intersperse within the forest. But you notice that it's starting to get kind of thinned out here, isn't it? Or you go to other places, well, forget about those trees. Cut them down. Let's have some livestock. The grass down there is very nutrient poor, so the cows don't gain really good weight. And the grass doesn't live on this poor soil for very long. You know, most of the nutrients are up in the canopy anyway. So they have to keep moving around. They have to keep cutting down trees to move their livestock around to keep them fed. And it takes a really, really long time for those forests to come back, by the way. This is a Gold Lion tamarin that was trying to get across one of those agricultural openings to get from one forest patch to the next, and it probably got picked off by a harpy eagle. Or it could have been a jaguarundi or ocelot, a feral dog or cat. So these animals are really adaptable, but the problem is they have to be up in the forest for protection. So as soon as you isolate them on this little island, they really have any place to go, and they can get picked off by predators pretty easily. Here you can see the state of the landscape in this area, just a lot of clear cut. This was probably cut perhaps 20 or 30 years before we got there. And you can see almost nothing has returned except some of these African grease grass that they've imported, basically, to cover the land side there. Or flying over, you can see there's urban areas, of course, just like any place. So the forest is under constant attack. Here's a great idea. Let's say, let's put a hydroelectric dam in, and when we do, it'll flood out all the rainforest behind it. And there again, you've got more habitat loss because human needs require electricity, right? Here we're running around trying to get into the last little forest patches that farmers own before the farmers cut them down. And we would find one or two monkeys in here, try to catch them, trap them. You can see a couple right here trying to figure out how to get the banana out without getting caught. Sometimes we had one monkey that actually figured out how to get a trap every single time. She was so smart, she always got out. It doesn't matter what we did to fortify the trap, she found a way to get out. It's pretty smart little female. When we collect them, we anesthetize them, we collect some genetic material, blood, fur, we measure them, we do a lot of different analysis. We would mark them with a special hair dye on their tail, band them so we can recognize them. We'd cage them up and then take them back out in the forest. In fact, these are really just cages coming down from the Smithsonian heading to Brazil to take some captive reared animals and let them go. And they did intense training to try to get them ready to survive in the wild. And it was a miserable disaster because almost all those animals got picked off by predators. So if a breeding pair could survive long enough to reproduce, then their offspring would survive. But it was an extremely expensive program. And I always wonder, well, why can't you just take like genetic material you have in the captive population? We had maybe 4,000 tamarins in zoos around the world, and you only had 200 tamarins in the wild. Maybe we can use reproductive technology to bring genetics together between the different populations. Oh, no, we can't do that. We might introduce a disease that could wipe out the wild population. Well, there was some merit to that, so they never went forward with that idea. Instead, which makes sense, they needed more habitat. So their version of the National Forest Service, IBAMA, decided, not Obama, but IBAMA, decided to buy up a large forest reserve owned by a rubber tree plantation company. It had a lot of forest in it. There was some clear cutting on the periphery of it. Here you can see some more of the forest over here, a little less cutting here. It was 3 times as big as the reserve where Poço das Antas is located, and they took all those farm monkeys that they caught, let them go because they'd survive. And today the population of tamarins is doing really well. There's about 1,000 tamarins now in the wild, thanks to the conservation efforts there. We have technicians down there, they're watching them, they're observing their behavior, collecting data on them. There's public education, which has to go on. You have to have the community buy into the project. In reality, though, all of this is not to save the tamarin, it's to save the biodiversity. There are charismatic species we're using to save the natural biota there. And we know that. We knew that then. But they're not interested in biodiversity. They're interested in the tamarins, right? And that's what we focus on and help them appreciate. And they help to support that. So they're less likely to go in and kill the tamarins for food or to poach them, okay? Another education. They have like a little museum down there at the reserve so they can kind of learn more about them. So anyway, there's a whole host of people, not me. I just went around and learned a little bit. I didn't really contribute a lot, but I did learn a lot. I learned that forest fragmentation is happening all over the place. But one of the things I noted in the monkeys down there, we had a female that had a really nasty eye infection. And I said, we really should treat her. And I advised her, no, we have to let natural processes go the way they're going to go. We can't interfere with evolution here. Thinking, we already did. There's only 200 monkeys left. We've completely wiped out all their habitat. I think we've already interfered. Oh, no, okay, we can't do it. So that animal eventually died. I came back and I said, we need to put some sort of monitoring program in place. And I've said this many times in different places I've gone. And, he gave me the same jargon until a couple months later, Chagas disease broke out. And they were in danger of losing all their monkeys. So then they had to intervene. They had to get medication there. We were going to lose all 200 of the monkeys, perhaps, from these nasty little bugs that bite you and turn around and poop on you on the cut. And then the trypanosome here gets into your blood. And over a period of 10 to 15 years, slowly eats away at your heart until you're dead. That's a pleasant one, right? So here was an interesting sort of disease. I looked at that and I said, biodiversity, disease, something's going on here. I just can't quite figure out what's going on. We have multiple species of organisms interacting here, right? And it seems like the opportunity for that's happening much easier because we changed the habitat. We've allowed different species that maybe wouldn't have come in contact with each other to come in contact and then allow for disease to spread. So I was thinking, as I went along in my years, why are we worrying about terraforming Mars? There was a big program NASA put forward. Let's go and make Mars habitable for human beings. We'll send microbes there and all that good stuff. Here's Mars. Looks like a nice place to live, right? I thought, well, we've been terraforming this planet for the last 10,000 years, right? I heard this on NPR the other week. I didn't catch the name of the poet, but this is what she commented to the interviewer. I have no doubt that man can construct an ugly world that would work fine, but we have a beautiful world. What does that say? So certainly the aesthetics of our planet appeals to us. Certainly we're biologists. We probably have something about the world that fascinates us to want to learn about it. So I probably am not having a hard time selling you on why we should save biodiversity. But how do we sell our students, or how do we sell the general public? How do we make this a really important mission? It starts out innocent enough, right? Even down in Brazil. We got to go protect the borders, send some settlers out there in the Amazon, set up some settlements, cut down a few trees, grow some manioc. Okay, now we need roads. Now we need schools, okay? And over time, we get agricultural lands. And over time, we have more agricultural lands. There's more people. You got to feed them. 7.5 billion people in the world now, right? Doubling time is 24 years. Ouch. I don't know. I'm having a hard time getting to work some days, right? I can't imagine having twice as many people on the road fighting it out with me. Here we go. Oh, we get some cities in, kind of like an Ann Arbor. Oh, that's not enough. Let's some mid-rises. How about some high-rises? Yeah. How long can this go on? It's a good question. An ugly world. How did we get here? We got here because we stand upright. We walk around on two legs. We have opposable thumbs. We hold on tools. We got a souped-up CC brain. First, it was to avoid predators as we scavenged their carcass prey that they had hunted down and try to use tools to bash them over the head so they wouldn't kill us, and banded together, made small groups, right? Something shifted in our pelvis to allow us to stand upright compared to our chimpanzee relative here. We were an African savanna species. We still are. We stand up because we're paranoid. What's out there? Are there lions that are going to eat us? I'm so scared. Come, stay with me. Get your spears, right? You get in your SUV, you're doing the same thing. Is there anybody around the corner? I want my head up really high, okay? This is Oliver. He's a chimp that lived in the St. Louis Zoo, I think back in the 30s and 40s. He walked upright all the time. Apparently there's a natural or spontaneous mutation that occurs every few generations where a chimp will walk bipedally all the time. So whatever genetic switches are going on to convert that pelvis from the chimpanzee to the human actually probably isn't really difficult to do. Certainly there's a selective advantage for coming around here and watching over the grass and see if there's predators out there. Here are a few sprigs of trees, the savanna, right? We love our grass. I think it's wired into our DNA. Everywhere we go, we got to have our grass. It's got to have a lawn. It's got to be mowed. We're going to play sports on it. I think I gave this talk a few years ago. The folks there thought I was smoking grass after they got done listening to me. All right? Boy, and look, our savanna roots wired in our DNA. What do we like to grow? Grass. All different species of grass to feed the animals that survive on that grass so that we can be happy. So we've got a new world order. We're taking 20 million species and we're condensing it down to a couple dozen perhaps. That's all we need. Everything else doesn't matter, right? What are the consequences? Here's oil. Our discovery of oil pretty much coincides right with our population explosion, which we're still going through. Right? We had some, gradual up and down in our population through time. We had a plague that knocked us out. Interesting. A plague. Multiple species coming together to knock down our species, right? Fleas, rats, all that good stuff growing in those urban environments, plus the bacterium. Okay, so we lost a big chunk of the world population. Here we are, soaring up. Because we need this oil to create a giant African savanna everywhere on the planet to grow our rice and our corn crops and take care of those animals. You are just walking barrels of oil. We are a very expensive species, you think about it, energetically. Remember I said the first slide, we use over a third of the world's resources just here alone. We only, 5% of the population globally? Right? We're very expensive in America. We're expensive everywhere. We are definitely going beyond our carrying capacity. The question is, we know there's going to be a crash. It's just when? When's that crash going to occur and how's it going to occur? So this is about the time everybody gets depressed on me, right? I don't know. Are we roaches? Any kind of organism put into a container with all its resources provided, all of its biotic potential available to it, is going to reproduce like crazy, right? AIDS, HIV. This AIDS, HIV infection rate, AIDS cases rate looks like an exponential growth curve to me because we're the food, we're the resource, we're the host. And we could talk about, and there's a nice exhibit down at the Natural History Museum downtown that talks about the evolution of HIV. If you're interested, you can check it out. But when I got through at Maryland studying the study with the tamarin monkeys and another species, a prairie vole I was working on, I came here to Michigan and we were working with viruses to put genes into cancer cells. And genes that would be sensitive to certain drugs that would kill those cancer cells. So I started looking into viruses, and actually HIV is a very good virus to insert genes into the genome. It's a retrovirus. But the problem is you don't have good control over where it goes. But I started looking in the literature, and I started thinking back to my conservation roots, and I'm thinking, virulence should increase with increasing host population size. I think that's pretty standard. I think we'll see, you look in epidemiology literature, that the more opportunities a virus has to reproduce, the more virulent or deadly it can afford to become, if you're looking forward through time. And AIDS is a very deadly disease, as we already know. And there are different, you can break it out, which continents on the planet see the highest HIV infections and all. We see Africa, where it first began, is really hurting. There are new programs now that try to bring that down, but it's only what you can do country by country in terms of controlling it. So then I started thinking about all the different kinds of infectious diseases out there that people worry about. Here's a T cell being attacked by HIV virus right here. Got kits that test for HIV at home. But you got all these things you hear about in the news every so often coming up. Then I started looking at it and I started thinking about all the different species of infectious disease and what are all the different, sorry this is from an overhead I copied, but what are all the different species that they can infect? And then I've looked at the literature and I'm starting to see that in the last 20 years we're seeing more and more emerging infectious diseases coming up out of the blue that affect more and more species simultaneously. So there are interspecific types of viruses and pathogens out there that seem to be coming on the radar more and more. Certainly talk about Lyme disease, right? Ticks, deer, humans. Rocky Mountain spotted fever has been with us for a while, carried by ticks. We know about sleeping sickness from the tsetse fly and the trypanosomes that attack the nervous system. These have been around for a while, all right? Measles, interestingly, came from rinderpest. So when humans started becoming more agrarian and setting up those farmlands and starting domesticating those animals, we started coming in close contact with the infectious diseases those animals had, right? They started jumping into our population. So how will landscape level changes affect species composition and population sizes? That's a question you can ask yourself, and you probably already know, right? If we make things better for certain species and our landscape or land use practices, then certainly those species are going to increase in size. If you got more of those animals, then any disease that breaks out, like right now you got chronic wasting disease in deer, that's going to proliferate. You've got more opportunities to spread. So we sometimes refer to these as density-dependent mortality factors, right? You've all heard that, I'm sure. So here's one, it came through Michigan about 12, 15 years ago. Tuberculosis, bovine tuberculosis, being spread from farm to farm by the deer. So the hunters would bait the deer near the farm lots. The cow would be near the bait, cough on it. The deer pick it up, get the TB, go on next farm, infect the next farm. And we had this big problem. Humans can get the TB. You can get bovine tuberculosis. In fact, we think that our ancestors first got TB by scavenging from those bovine animals in Africa, perhaps. And there was an evolutionary jump really easily into the human tuberculosis that still lingers with us today. Certainly we're all aware of the cold and how unpleasant it is, but lately we've turned our attention to the flu, right? The bird flu, H5N1, always having to come up with vaccines for that. We've had huge kill-offs of birds down in Mexico and over in Asia. Just in the last few weeks, we've had countries over in Asia having to kill off 5,000, 10,000 of their poultry. Mexico, I think, just killed off something crazy, like 10 million chickens or something down there. There's a huge number of these livestock animals out there, huge populations of them that I think we're already pretty much familiar with. So lots of opportunities for avian flu to have access to us. And really, it's kind of a triangle. If you wanted to knock down the flu, you just have to go over to Asia, where most of the pigs, the chickens, the people are all clustered together, intermixing their excretions, right? Allowing the viruses to have sex inside these organism cells and coming up with these recombinant new types of bugs. And the pig's a great mixing vessel for that. So if we can just keep the waterfowl and the pigs separated on the farms, then we probably have a good chance of keeping these viruses from recombining so easily and developing new flus for us every year. But you gotta have a hard time convincing him to do that, because by tradition he's been doing farming for a long, long time. And there are lots of farmers throughout Southeast Asia and Asia. How about geese? Been down to Gallup Park lately? That's a pleasant place to walk, isn't it? Try not to step in anything. Or any of your local parks. Geese population soaring, making the world so much better for geese. They're crapping in the water. They're spreading all their different types of parasites and bacteria into the water. I was curious. I thought, well, I'm seeing certain species proliferate around here. I'm seeing more starlings, cowbirds, right? I'm seeing fewer warblers. I wonder in the breeding bird census, are we seeing shifts? And we are. We're seeing throughout all the different states in the country, certain species are proliferating. I'll bet you those are the ones that get along just fine in our New World Order. And those that can't, that need those forests, they're going by the wayside, right? So we're seeing huge population shifts in certain species. This one's interesting to me. The American crow is doing very well out there. Incredibly intelligent bird. Population's going off the chart. And they're the ones that get in the West Nile. They're the ones that are spraying the West Nile around, okay? Doing a pretty good job of it too. This virus here has a pretty, high kill rate, high lethality rate for crows. And they look at the mosquito infection rate here as compared to the death rate. And you can see a dramatic decrease in crow populations. The mosquitoes are carrying the West Nile virus from animal to animal and to us as well. Not just to them, but lots of other species of birds can now get West Nile virus. Horses can get West Nile virus. This is an amazing idea, isn't it? A virus that can just freely move through so many different species easily and proliferate and become more and more virulent as it goes along. It's becoming more of a generalist, like a cowbird, because it can. It's so easy, isn't it? Huge population numbers, all juxtaposed in the same area, depending on the same habitat requirements. It's amazing to me. Go to Chicago. You can see the amount of crows getting West Nile, and you see the human cases tracking right after it. Interesting things, aren't they? Very efficient inserting their genetic material into our cells. So let's assume that viruses compete with one another, just like any other species of living thing on the planet. Natural selection should favor a highly virulent strain evolving over time. Now think about it. It makes sense because if you're a virus and you've got easy access to so many different hosts, you could make all the progeny you want, probably infect somebody very quickly nearby, and kill the host on your way out, like burning your bridges behind you. And that would keep any other conspecific virus from getting in and competing with you. So it makes sense. Now, I'm not the originator of this idea. This idea was taught to me in passing by Lin Chow, who's a virologist and evolutionary biologist out in San Diego. He used to be at Maryland. And he started planting some seeds in my mind. I started thinking about this more and more over the years. Here's an interesting one, Ebola, right? Nearly a 90% kill rate. You just bleed out of everything in your body. It's pretty nasty. For a long time, they were trying to figure out, where is this virus hanging out? Why does it come in like a fire, burn up all the human fuel, and then seem to go away, and then pop up again some years later? So I think there's been a lot of studies on that, and they find that there's sort of, again, multi-species interaction. It's the bats that are hanging out. The virus hangs out like a reservoir. There are gorillas that can also be a reservoir and get infected by it. So we have the ability to move or transmit the virus around between different species. I don't say the gorillas at a high population, but certainly the bats can be very densely packed in the caves, right? But they have their own problems here in the States, right? They have this white nose syndrome that has a 100% kill rate for bats in the caves. So if a caver brings the fungi into the cave, this fungi will get onto the bats, suffocate them, and it'll spread through the whole colony. You lose the whole colony very quickly. Okay, so again, density-dependent mortality factors. We know that there are different ways that our species of interest could be distributed out there in the environment, right? Some animals like to clump together, especially for warmth in the winter on a wire. When they're mating, though, in the spring, they probably are, either really cozy with one and very angry to others, right? So their dispersion rate can change. Sometimes you've got species of plants or animals clumped. But imagine that for the sake that we think these are different species in each of these petri dishes and you superimpose them one upon the other, that's biodiversity. That's a lot of different species interspersed with one another, kind of spacing everybody out. Kind of like what the function of the neutrons inside the atom, right? They're just spacers to keep the protons from beating up each other, right? So that's why I kind of look at it. By having different species of organisms interspersed and keeping their population size at a reasonable level, kind of like this, then everyone's happy. So imagine that we took all of in this imaginary world all the arable land and condense it into a big box. Everything has equal amount of resources, light, water, all that it needs. And over time, you see these various different species of organisms based on these hexagon grid, these hexagon shapes. So you've got some producers in green, you got your herbivores, primary consumers in blue, you got carnivores in red, because that's danger, right? Omnivores like us in yellow, right? And they have to be in contact with, especially if you're an omnivore, you have to have food, either plant or animal, right? Certainly if you're a carnivore, you want not just plants, that's not a good idea. You want to have some animals, right, around you, juxtaposed to you. So how you could look at this is imagine each polygon is a particular species. The entire size of this represents the population size of that species. A side is an interaction zone between another species. Okay? And the length of the side tells you how many interactions there would be with that species. So this is something I've been thinking about in my mind. How can I mathematically quantify this idea to develop a predictor model that we can then test? Which I guess we are testing unwittingly anyway. We're all part of the experiment right now. But could we go out and look at the natural environment and see if we could put some of this to the test and see what happens when we change the landscape? So in other words, as certain species go extinct, other species will fill in the niche or the space, take up more room. But there'll be fewer of them, so your species richness goes down. And then if you go even further, you have even less species richness, right? But the boxes are getting bigger because each species now has more available resources to exploit and its population goes up, right? I don't know. Kind of makes sense to me, I guess. There we are, sort of dominating the landscape, right? And we have a few other species that we like that have really large populations and a few others that we need, maybe on the periphery here. What do we really need? We need in terms of biodiversity, a very poor planet, right? With just the things we need to survive. Ha-ha! But if you're a virus, you're going, oh boy, what a great world this is. I can move so easily. Look at this transition zone here. I can move so easily. There's so many interactions going on. So many opportunities to have a mutation come up that allows me not to infect corn, perhaps, but maybe a mouse, or the mouse infect us, right? Hantavirus, right? Mad cow's disease, certainly other diseases like that. I looked through the literature and I was trying to find something that, so if somebody else had actually thought about this and had even published it. And this is the only thing I could find from a textbook I actually had back in college. So Odom and Odom, they try to look at ecology from an energetic standpoint, right? They try to basically economically value all different aspects of the natural world in a way we'd understand. We standardize it to energy units like coal, and coal was worth a certain amount of money. So they try to look at all these processes that we ignore in economics. And they came up with this in their book. And I saw this sort of aside. It was never taught to me. I just found it. So natural systems are using biodiversity as a device to eliminate monoculture because that is inherently unstable. So having these huge monocultures, these giant red pine forests, these giant fields of corn, all genetically the same, right, is unstable in the ecological system. But it still wasn't hitting it on the head for me. I thought there's something more, and then I started putting all the pieces together in the last few years, and I started thinking about it like this. Natural systems use biodiversity as a buffer against the evolution of highly virulent pathogens. Okay, so this is another way of looking at biodiversity in my mind. As species differentiate over time, pathogens will tend to specialize, because they have to, as interspecific transmission becomes more difficult between widely diverging species. It's harder for those viruses to latch onto the receptors in widely divergent species. It's not going to be easy to do that, right? Less virulent pathogens will be favored by natural selection as their host species density decreases. right? Which makes sense. You get sick, you're on the farm, your nearest neighbor's 5 miles away, right? Let's say it's a cold. Perhaps in the next 5 days, you go meet your buddy. Now, if that virus had killed you in the first 2 days, you never meet your buddy 5 miles away. But now you can't. So you have to be less virulent if you want to get spread in a low population density environment. Or conversely, as fewer and more similar species interact on an increasingly regular basis, the greater the probability that pathogens will become increasingly virulent over time. Inevitably, highly virulent pathogens will serve as a powerful natural selective force against monoculture, that's what Odum and Odum said, and will drive the evolution of new species and ultimately biodiversity. I think biodiversity is here not by an accident. We have a check and balance system in place. Who's going to have checkmate? I studied wildlife management at Michigan State. I learned all the different ways you can manage the landscape and wildlife, and this is what I came up with at the end of all that. All of the problems in the world have nothing to do with the world, they have everything to do with us and our drive, I guess, to reproduce. So I'd like to thank you, and I'd like you guys, if you're interested, you really should check out the One Health Initiative. It's out there where veterinarians and doctors are trying to look at how environmental health affects human health and try to make a case of why we need to do more in convincing not only just our students but the public to protect biodiversity. All right, thank you very much. Any questions? Yeah. When they first tried it, I haven't kept up to see if they've tried it again or if they've tweaked it around. When they first tried it, most of the breeding pairs were picked off within the first year by predators. And it was a novel and interesting idea. When they first developed it, they used the zoo itself as a training ground. So during the summer, the tamarins can run wild in the zoo because they won't leave usually. And they're radio collared in case they go out into D.C. They trained them by throwing fuzzy footballs at them with fur or with feathers on them, simulating a hawk or an eagle. And they would try to hit the animal off its perch. So they go, whoa, something feathery might hurt me. Or throw it over its head. Or they'd have snakes in the cage where the animal was, and they try to induce some adverse reaction between this fake snake and the animal, right? They did all this. They had them probe crevices with their fingers to get applesauce out of PVC pipes. So it was like boot camp for captive animals. And when it was all said and done, they had this calamity. Now, they did get a few breeding pairs, as I mentioned, to reproduce. So they survived long enough to reproduce. Those kids did fine. So there's a lot, and especially with primates, you know, there's a lot of training that has to go on between the parent and the child, right? Cool. Any other questions? Yeah.
So your cowbird study was interesting because it was their 3 kilometer out distance.
Yeah.
And particularly on ecotones. The cowbirds were sticking to those ecotones where they could have both forest and also agricultural.
Right.
We always tell our students ecology and such that, ecotones are the place to be because you have the diversity and the resources of 2 different habitats meeting.
Yeah.
So are cowbirds, are species now having to make a choice between do I reside on the ecotone and have the resources but the risk of cowbirds, or do I go further inside and not have that risk?
I don't know if anybody's done a behavior study to see if individual species or individuals within a species are making a choice or not. I will say that if you are an edge nester, you're probably not going to change, and you're going to be blasted away by cowbirds, and you're going to have a very poor population growth. There's actually going to be a population decline on those edges. So we see that over and over again. If you're a forest nester, your population growth or the number of progeny you get out of there is going to be dependent on what happens when those cowbirds get to you, if they get to you. So the further you can be away from that edge and from any other food resource the cowbird depends on, the better you're going to have at being reproductively successful if you're a bird, like ovenbirds and thrushes and things like that. Whether,
When that's competition, the further you go because you're trying to get away from the cowbird.
yeah, but I don't know if those birds are actually thinking, I need to move because of the cowbird. I guess they could learn is say, if they're around to watch what the cowbird's doing and what happens and think about it, then they could make a decision like that. I don't know if I think crows can make decisions like that. They're smart enough to do that. But your average neotropical migrant, I don't know if it has the brain power to figure that out. Through natural selection, we'll probably get individuals that can recognize the eggs. As long as we don't destroy too much of the habitat and give them the time, I think many neotropical migrants eventually will develop that. But nothing so far, other than catbirds and robins. They're very good at catching the eggs and throwing them out. Yeah.
Would you say, I don't know if you do teach intro to biology, but do you?
I've taught at a few places here and there in the area in the last 12 years, but not here.
Would you say like the most important topic to teach like a non-majors biology course would be biodiversity? Would that be the most important topic, do you think?
I think it should be now, and especially even if the biology major wanted to go in the healthcare field. I mean, it's a healthcare worker is going to be getting the brunt of this, and they already are. There's all these contact precautions they have to learn as a nurse, and infectious diseases are constantly on their mind, and there's going to be more of them. I think as biologists and teachers, I think we really need to make that our focus. There's nothing wrong with talking about blue crabs. There's nothing wrong with talking about earthworms. There's nothing wrong with talking about particular bacterium. Whatever fascinates you is fine, but I think we need to put it into a broader perspective and say, by the way, let's not get rid of these because they serve this role in the environment. They have a purpose. Everything has a purpose in our biodiverse world. And maybe to think about our own population, how we should be dealing with that, and talk about infectious diseases and try to take that ecology maybe and put into sort of a human health bent, not because other species aren't important, and humans are. It's that we're the ones making decisions right now with the planet. And we need to get a generation of people who will go into politics, into business, or whatever, who are going to make decisions that make sense, right? I think that's a focus we should be looking at. Yeah.
Well, I teach a course in conservation biology, and sometimes the students think the response is that after learning so much, they feel like it's almost kind of too depressing because
Yeah.
the news gets worse and worse.
Yeah.
So sometimes they feel almost kind of overwhelmed, and so I feel like I have to kind of.
You have to cheer them up.
Here's some success stories. So it's
Right. There are success stories. Again, you saw one in particular one. There are a lot of them, but there are others that we need to go much further with. And I understand. I gave this talk in year 2000 at the medical school as a postdoc, and I heard the crickets sing when I was done. And all of my colleagues got up and walked out with just sort of disgusted looks on their face, because this was before SARS. This was before even Ebola was making a really big dent. This was before the bird flu. It's like everybody forgot from collective consciousness what the Spanish flu is about. And these are healthcare workers. I think if I gave the same talk today, there'd be more interest in it. Because it's like it hits home now, right, when all these things seem to be coming up in the media. So I don't think the students are going to be completely ignorant of what's out there in the media. So why not talk about it? Why not bring it into the classroom? Introduce it with your ecology, introduce it even with your organismal level studies, and say, how does this species benefit the environment? What are all the interactions? Make interdisciplinary thinking students, because I think that'll help them with whatever career they go into, or to be a better, more educated society, I think, down the road. Cool. Is that it? What time is it? The clock's stuck in 10. Okay, so I'm done. Thank you.